today's video, I'm going to talk about the 4 mansions of Saint Teresa. At this point in her classic on the development of prayer, Saint Teresa begins to speak at length and in great details about the inner experiences of infused contemplation. The 4 mansions are entirely about prayer in its infused developments. One of the reasons Saint Teresa gives for writing expansively about the 4 mansions is that the greatest number of souls enter these beginnings of infused prayer. Another reason is that it is at this stage of development that the natural is united with the supernatural, and great deal of harm can be done. We have this time of prayer development, the mingling between human and divine modes of praying, and hence a good number of problems can and do arise. So first of all, let us understand what is infused contemplation. Infused contemplation is divinely given, general, non-conceptual, loving awareness of God. There are no images, no concepts, no ideas, no visions. Sometimes this awareness takes the form of a loving attention, sometimes a dry desire, sometimes a strong thirsting. None of these experiences is the result of reading or reasoning. These experiences are given and received by the soul. The infusion is serene and purifying. It can be delicate and brief, or in advanced stages of prayer, a burning, powerful, absorbing, prolonged. Always it is transformative of the person, usually imperceptibly and gradually, but on occasion, obviously and suddenly. Saint Teresa uses her water image to distinguish actively produced discursive prayer from this infused type. It is the difference between a person's filling a basin through human effort by drawing the water and then transporting it to a basin, and a basin receiving water because it rests in the very source, that is, in God, the ever-flowing fountain. In this second case, the rising of water is quiet and peaceful. One does not know where it comes from or how it arises. As the person grows into this new infused prayer, God progressively takes over the will and then the intellectual and imagination. God occupies and absorbs these faculties by what He gives. And Saint Teresa calls this as the suspension of faculties. That is, they are relieved of ordinary human necessity of working at thoughts, ideas, and affections. It is not we who decide when this change shall take place. It is God who gives the new communion, and thus it is He who takes the initiative. Hence, it would be foolish for one person to decide, I like this idea of infused prayer, I'll begin it tomorrow. No, it's not possible. It is God who has to give it, and He chooses the time when to give it. In these 4 mansions, Saint Teresa distinguishes 2 kinds of infused prayer: the initial recollection and the prayer of quiet. So let's first talk about initial recollection. Before prayer of quiet is given, almost always one will experience recollection, an infused and gentle awareness given by God and not produced by any human effort. One is, as it were, gathered together in God and desires solitude to be with Him. The senses and the external things slowly lose their hold upon person. Here the Lord calls with a call so gentle that even they can hardly recognize it. And these people are sometimes in the castle before they have begun to think about God at all. Saint Teresa notes that a person is almost invariably introduced to contemplative prayer in this manner. This being drawn to be alone with the alone is not the result of a reasoned out conclusions, as was the case of discursive meditation. Key to Saint Teresa's explanation of the fourth mention is the occupation of the will with God. At the moment when this prayer is given, the soul is captive and is not free to love anything but God. The soul is so satisfied with God that as long as the recollection lasts, the quiet and calm are not lost, since the will is united with God, even though the two faculties are distracted. In fact, little by little, will brings the intellect and memory back to recollection. Even though the will may not be totally absorbed, it is so well occupied without knowing how that no matter what efforts the other two faculties make, they cannot take away its contentment and joy. Saint Teresa also makes the point that during the prayer of quiet, some distractions are entirely possible. For while the memory and intellect may be somewhat stilled, they are not completely lost, that is, absorbed in God. The person senses that he is close to the Lord and knows Him better, but with no clear ideas. The quiet is felt in different degrees at different times. It may last for a long while, even for a day or two. It follows then that one can enjoy this interior awareness even though engaged in exterior activities that require the attention of the mind. At such times, they serve the Lord in both these ways at once. The will, while in contemplation, is working without knowing how it does so. The prayer itself, therefore, is very easy when compared with the efforts involved in discursive meditation, and even if it lasts for a long time, it does not weary the recipient. Because it is infused, this prayer can be neither originated nor prolonged by our efforts or desires, and it can bring to one's intimate depth a great delight, a delight that can spill over into the body on the emotional level. Tears may accompany this contemplation, but if they do, they are gentle and without distress. So, what are the indicators of the growth in this fourth stage of prayer? In the prayer of quiet, the virtues grow incomparably better than the previous degrees of prayer. The person begins to lose the craving for worldly things. God gives a strong desire to grow in prayer and the resolve not to abandon it no matter what trials may arise. all servile fear disappears. One's love for God has much less self-interest. A need for prayerful solitude makes itself felt. Inner freedom of soul brings about less constraint in serving God. An oppressive fear of hell disappears, and a firm confidence of eventual fruition of the Lord takes its place. More lively faith begets a desire for penance and a diminution of fear of suffering. Now, knowing God much better, the person comes to realize more vividly his own misery. Having tasted divine delight, he now sees earthly things as mere refuse. Having grown so much in all virtues, this person will infallibly continue to grow in them unless he returns to deliberate neglect of prayer life. To the uninitiated, this description may sound too good to be true. But to those who have reached the fourth mansions, Saint Teresa's comments are seen to be completely correct. We should note that this growth is not chiefly the result of discursive deliberations together with an active plan of action. Imperceptibly and often with no explicit thoughts about the matter, one finds in oneself greater humility and patience and love and detachment and all else. Infused contemplation is indeed transformative of the person. One of the concerns that arises is, how do I operate in the prayer of quiet? Because advancing prayer is so different from what has gone before, what we need to learn is how we are to avoid placing obstacles before deepening divine action. The first bit of advice may come as a surprise. We must learn receptivity. Infused contemplation cannot be acquired, initiated, intensified, or prolonged, and yet, despite our knowing this in theory, we tend to act as though we can more or less control it. We know, likewise, that God does not force himself on the unwilling, but we are not as aware of the actuality that we can receive only what he chooses to give and when and how he chooses to give. We constantly presume that we know what ought to be happening in our prayer life. In our consumerist, productionist societies, there is a tendency to take for granted that we are in control of making happen whatever we want to have happen, and of determining how it will come about. This expectation results in resistance to the receptivity required for prayer. Speaking of this prayer of quiet, Saint Teresa observes that people are tempted to imagine that they can prolong it, and they may even try not to breathe. We can no more control this prayer than we can make the day break or stop night from falling. It is supernatural, infused, and something we cannot acquire. This prayer is a little spark of the Lord's true love which he begins to enkindle in the soul. And he desires that the soul grow in the understanding of what this love accompanied by delight is. For anyone who has experience this, it is impossible not to understand soon that this little spark cannot be acquired. Yet this nature of ours is so eager for delights that it tries everything, but it is quickly left cold because however much it may desire to light the fire and obtain this delight, it doesn't seem to be doing anything else than throwing water on it and killing it. Learning to be receptive is not only difficult to do, it is difficult to teach. Teresa therefore uses the image of a baby nursing at its mother's breast. As the mother gives her breast and her milk without baby's thought or effort, so the person at this prayer simply loves. There is no need to make efforts to understand or reflect on what is happening. The soul should realize that it is in his company and should merely drink the milk which His Majesty puts into its mouth and enjoy its sweetness. It is not His will that the soul should try and understand how it is enjoying it or what it is enjoying it. It should lose all thought of itself. When God wishes us to give up our human mode of praying, He illumines His mode and leads us into an absorption in Himself. The excessive multiplication of vocal prayers, even aside from time of mental prayer, can likewise impede growth. There are people who get into set habit of adding litany upon litany, devotion upon devotion, to the point where they leave little or no room for God to give what He wants to give. They do not understand contemplation, and they think that unless they are vocalizing, they are not praying. Referring to those who make up their own vocal prayer obligations, St. Teresa notes that they are so fond of speaking and reciting many vocal prayers very quickly, like one who wants to get the job done. Since they have obliged themselves to recite these every day, that even though the Lord places His kingdom in their hands, they do not receive it. But with their vocal prayers, they think they are doing better, and they distract themselves from the prayer of quiet. Distractions occur within the fourth mansions, for the infusion is often faint and fragile. In her typically vigorous style, the saint refers to the mind as being wild as madmen, wandering off after the most ridiculous things in the world. Her remedy is simple: pay no attention to it. For one may well laugh at it and treat it as a silly thing and remain in the state of quiet. St. Teresa touches upon three conditions for continued growth when one reaches the stage or the fourth mansions. The first condition for continued growth is never to give up habitual practice of prayer, for one is doomed if he does. To illustrate her point, she returns to the image of child at the breast. Just as the baby who has just begun to suck her breast is sure to die if it is being taken away from its mother, so for anyone who gives up prayer, unless he does so for some exceptional reason, but he returns to it quickly, he will go from bad to worse. The second condition, she says, is detachment from everything. One might think that active purification is confined to the first three mansions. Not so, says Teresa. If there is no lessening of selfish clingings, there is no growth in prayer. God brings one thus far as a pledge of great things He has in store. But if he sees the person return to the earth, he refrains from showing him the secrets of his kingdom. This is why spiritual people are not much more numerous. Her analysis of the problem is identical with Jesus' explanation of spiritual retardation. We do not mature, he says, because we are smothered by the cares and riches and pleasures of this life. And the number 3 condition is seek greater solitude without neglecting work or family. St. Teresa sees solitude as giving the Lord the opportunity to do His work in us, as well as our being readied for communion with Him. In this too, she is advocating nothing other than what Jesus Himself repeatedly did, going out to be alone in prayer with the Father for a long stretch of time, early in the morning or all through the night. There is a built-in proclivity in advancing prayer to seek solitude with the Beloved.